bit over a year ago, I made a video pointing out how much the original trilogy sucks. That video has gotten thousands of views, and most people seem to really appreciate it. So I thought that what I should do now is show you why the prequels are superior. Let's start off with what I would like to call Exhibit A. This is what became of Carrie Fisher after Star Wars, and her movies, the original trilogy, aged even worse than she did. By contrast, the female lead of the Star Wars prequels was Natalie Portman, who was always beautiful and talented, but has only become more beautiful and more talented as time has passed. And just as our appreciation for Natalie Portman has grown and continues to grow, so too does it stand with the Star Wars prequels. In particular with Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace, which is actually the best movie in the entire franchise. In 1999, George Lucas decided to renew his Star Wars franchise, and he decided rather than proceeding through time with Mark Hamill as Luke Skywalker and all of that, he would go back and tell the story of Anakin, the boy who'd grow up to become Darth Vader, and set in motion all the stuff that happened in the original trilogy. Well, it turns out that this actually started a trend in filmmaking where many movies would go back in time to do origin stories or prequels, and the fact is that no one has done it nearly as well as George Lucas did with The Phantom Menace. By 1999, George Lucas had a huge profile, he had self-confidence, he had experience, and he had been working on new ideas for Star Wars for about 15 years. So he had a script ironed out, so he wouldn't have to go on the fly like he did in the original trilogy, and he had a much higher profile vis-a-vis all the actors and actresses who would be working under him. So he had complete creative control, and we could really see his vision come to fruition in a way that would not be tampered with by lesser talents or people trying to promote themselves rather than the movie and the story and the universe. One critique of the prequels is that they rely heavily on CGI, but that's complete bullshit. The prequels get their distinctive look from very advanced model work that George Lucas was very good at. Lucas was the master of model work, and by 1999 he had it down to a fine art that no one else could match. I can prove that it has nothing at all to do with CGI. Look at any video game from 1999. Think about Half-Life, or hell, the video game version on PlayStation for Star Wars Episode 1. There is nothing at all which looks anything remotely like or as good as this movie from that time. The equipment in Star Wars Episode 1 is way cooler than it is in the original trilogy. Now you might say it's because of the passage of time. However, think about it logically. This movie is set before the original trilogy. So why is it that the Naboo starfighter looks like, I don't know, a starfighter, whereas the X-Wing is basically a bastardized F-18 Eagle? I don't know. It's because, obviously, the model work got way better, the ideas got way better, and George Lucas was able to use his imagination and achieve his full potential in this film. The look and the technology level of the bad guys, the Trade Federation, was also very high in this movie. Unlike in the original trilogy where the Empire's clearly using mass-produced bullshit like stuff you would buy from Walmart that was made in China, the Trade Federation is using high-end shit. Like stuff that is completely able to go toe-to-toe with what the good guys have. So these droid starfighters are things that could be made by, say, like Russia, if the Naboo starfighter is kind of like an American F-18 Eagle. So this could be like a MiG or something. So this is something that puts the bad guys on parity with the good guys. Whereas in Star Wars, there's always a qualitative difference between the Rebels, who had really good equipment, and the Empire, which used garbage. So that is another major improvement in the prequels in general, but in Star Wars Episode 1 in particular. Famously, A New Hope began with Luke walking through the desert, bitching and moaning after a pointless chase scene between Darth Vader and Princess Leia. Star Wars Episode 1 cuts right through the bullshit and gets to the point. There's a trade dispute, and there are two Jedi Knights addressing it. One of them we meet is called Qui-Gon Jinn. He's a new character, and we'll talk about him more. And the other one is someone who's familiar to us in a younger version, his name is Obi-Wan Kenobi. So right off the bat, we've jumped in, we've reestablished contact with this universe. We have a bad guy in the Trade Federation, and we have good guys, and they're already in action. So there was no bullshit, no delay, no whining, no moaning, no groaning, just straight up delivery of what the fans want and what the fans need. One of the major shortcomings of the original trilogy is that there were no actual badasses. Darth Vader sucked, he's just a bad ripoff of Frankenstein and RoboCop combined, and Han Solo is just a criminal who tries to get laid and sometimes succeeds. However, there are some actual badasses in the prequels, and the biggest one of them all is Qui-Gon Jinn, played by none other than Liam fucking Neeson. Now, Qui-Gon is this sort of rebel renegade Jedi. He does what he needs to do. He's sort of like the cop who gets things done. He's very smart, he's wise, he's a great mentor, he's a great warrior. He never really makes any mistakes. He's someone who is a great inspiration, and we'll see that he has a massive influence for the better on everyone else in the movie. He sees potential in people and he unlocks it. He has that ability despite the fact that he himself has been mistreated and oppressed by the Jedi Council. Qui-Gon has a student named Obi-Wan Kenobi, and unfortunately Obi-Wan sucks. He is one of the biggest weaknesses in this movie. He is basically someone who has an 18-year-old body with the soul of a 58-year-old trapped inside. He bitches and moans like he's Luke in A New Hope. Now, this Obi-Wan is not badass or cool. He does get better, and in Episode 2, he grows a beard in honor of his great mentor Qui-Gon Jinn. However, in this movie, he's a constant source of annoyance, and we are quite lucky that he was not really a big factor in a lot of those scenes on Tatooine where Qui-Gon Jinn is allowed to do his thing without having Obi-Wan standing there bitching and moaning like an abused wife. Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan have to take refuge on the surface of Naboo after things go south up in the sky, and they meet Queen Amidala, played by Natalie Portman, who's a very dynamic character. She's very intelligent, and she was the elected queen of Naboo. Now, she is someone who actually seems like a queen. She has royal mannerisms, and she has the costume, and she is someone who has the traits one would look for in an elected leader. So she is someone who brings a lot to the table and isn't just an empty crown. Jar Jar Binks is the most unfairly maligned character in Star Wars history, and here I'm going to defend him once and for all. Now, he is central to the plot. Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan ultimately could not possibly have achieved their mission on Naboo without the help of Jar Jar Binks. Now, Jar Jar is their key to gaining acceptance with the Gungans, and he also is their cultural guide to a whole different world. So the Naboo on the planet are humans. They're like Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon. So there's no problem there. But this is a different species that lives on the same planet, and they evolved side by side. And they're two societies which try to stay separate and have had some issues in the past. And Jar Jar is sort of a victim of this sort of cultural clash, but ultimately he ends up being the guy who heals the rift, and he's able to realize his potential as an ambassador because Qui-Gon sees something in Jar Jar and brings it out, and then Jar Jar will go on to be a great man in the Republic, even though his role was downplayed in the other two prequel films due to George Lucas backing off of the character. What George Lucas should have done is press onward with Jar Jar, because he's actually a brilliant character with a lot to offer, and as we go through the plot, we're going to see more and more about why Jar Jar is actually probably the second best character in this movie after Qui-Gon Jinn. To unite what I just said about Jar Jar with what I was saying earlier about George Lucas's model work and imagination, I want you to look at this beautiful Gungan city, which was underwater and hidden from the Naboo. So during that invasion, the Gungans kept such a low profile that the Trade Federation didn't even know that they inhabited the planet, and they would ultimately be the sort of fifth column and this untapped X factor in this whole conflict. So again, you see how George Lucas was able to utilize his creative genius, and how Jar Jar is actually the key to the plot. So all of this fits together like a jigsaw puzzle. Qui-Gon and crew escape, but they don't have enough gas to get to Coruscant, so they stop off at a place called Tatooine, which is a little shithole out in the middle of nowhere, to get more parts and supplies and fuel, and this is where the plot really takes off. On Tatooine, they meet the shrewd businessman Watto, who is a parts dealer who deals with spaceships. Now, the problem is that Tatooine is not a member of the Republic, at least not effectively, and it's under the rule of the Hutts, who are actually criminals, which would have been a nice bit of context to know during Return of the Jedi when we saw Jabba the Hutt, but I'll leave my complaints about that movie aside since I've already made a whole video about that. Now, Watto, as it says, is a shrewd businessman, and he's also a pretty just businessman. He has a slave named Anakin who's very skilled, and Watto, it turns out, is a kind slave master, and also someone who will keep his word even if he doesn't necessarily want to. So, on a certain level, Watto actually is a very honorable character, which is something that goes unnoticed by a lot of people who try to pretend like he's supposed to be a Jew, which is complete bullshit because no Jews have wings and are supposed to be flies. As soon as Qui-Gon meets Anakin, he knows that Anakin's no ordinary slave boy, and as he begins to talk with him, he realizes that Anakin has special powers, that Anakin is attuned to the Force. And luckily, this movie actually has expository dialogue, unlike the original trilogy, where the story just kind of bumbles along and you figure things out as you go. Here, Anakin actually has a phone call with Obi-Wan talking about midichlorians, so that way we know why Anakin is powerful, and we know why every Jedi is powerful. So the whole midichlorian thing is actually explained in detail. And we also know that the reason why Jedi seem to have really good reflexes is because they can see a little bit into the future, and that they can literally think ahead. So they are literal supermen, just like the people in Greek mythology, like Epimetheus and Odysseus and all these other characters. After being encouraged by Qui-Gon to use the Force and to trust his instincts, Anakin is able to finally fulfill his lifelong dream of actually entering a pod race and winning. Before, he had entered but not done that well. And here we see Anakin's genius as a pilot, his use of the Force, and also his mechanical know-how come into play. So it turns out that all those years as a slave mechanic for Watto are a lot of what made Anakin the formidable Jedi he'll become in episodes 2 and 3. So the people who would condemn Watto because he's a slave owner are missing the point, and they don't understand the ways of the Force. Also, pod racing is fucking awesome. It has all of the thrills and spills of the Reno air races with the accessibility of something like NASCAR. So everything about it is just perfect, and I love how they set up this whole system for how it works and how people from neighboring planets come in, how there's betting and cheating and fan favorites and all this stuff. So pod racing is its own mini contained universe, and you get all this in about 5 minutes worth of film. So George Lucas did an absolutely brilliant job of laying out how pod racing works. Qui-Gon's wisdom led him to put a bet on Anakin winning the race, and he was able to have Anakin freed from slavery with that bet. And that led to one of the most touching and heartbreaking scenes in cinematic history, where Anakin, the young 7 or 8-year-old boy who was perfectly happy at home with his mother, had to say goodbye to his mother, Shmi. And this was a very emotional and very realistic scene that was extraordinarily well acted, and anyone who wants to shit on Jake Lloyd should rewatch that scene, and what they'll see is that this is a guy who really should have stuck with acting, because he had more talent at the age of about 10 than most people, including a lot of very famous people, have or demonstrated at any point in their career. It also turns out that Anakin, being the mechanical genius that he was was in fact the inventor of C-3PO, and the guy who was putting together the unit that would go on to be in pretty much every Star Wars movie. Now, C-3PO is a useless character who's mostly there for comic relief, so you can see the progression in George Lucas's skills as a director. So C-3PO here, we get to see his origins, and we also get to see his deep connection to the Skywalker family. At the same time, we get to see him contrasted with Jar Jar Binks, who actually has a central role in the plot. So this was a fairly clever way for George Lucas to show his audience the evolution of his technique as a director and as a storyteller. And I, for one, catch on to what he's saying, and even though I'm not a big fan of the humble brag, I do think that George Lucas can pat himself on the back at least a little, because his technique clearly had improved dramatically. There's a simultaneous storyline developing, and it has its own kind of exposition. So while there's all this exposition about the good guys, about an equal amount is going on with the bad guys, and we learn that there's a secret bad guy well placed in the Republic government, and he has an apprentice who's like this assassin badass. This guy looks like a devil. And they're the ones pulling the strings of the Trade Federation. So all of the woes that have befallen Qui-Gon Jinn and his group ultimately go back to this masked man and his assistant. As they're leaving Tatooine and trying to board their ship, Qui-Gon and crew are attacked by Darth Maul, who comes out of nowhere on a speeder. And they have a badass and brief lightsaber battle where it's a pretty even match between the two of them, but we can see that Qui-Gon is clearly the better fighter from the fact that he's able to maneuver Darth Maul into the area he needs him to be at so that he, Qui-Gon, can jump on the ship. And he effectively coordinates this maneuver by giving instructions to Obi-Wan on where to put the ship and how to lower the ramp. So it's a very well choreographed moment, and it really shows that Obi-Wan respected Qui-Gon as a master, and that Qui-Gon was able to come up with plans really quickly and execute them. So it really goes to show you everything that's great about Qui-Gon Jinn, and it also shows that because Darth Maul is able to give Qui-Gon a legitimate challenge, that he is a bona fide badass bad guy. When the group arrives on Coruscant, they're immediately greeted by Senator Palpatine, who is the senator from Naboo and a political ally to Queen Amidala. And at this point, we've had no hints at all that Palpatine might be a bad guy. That only really comes about in the third movie, and the hints only become obvious once you've seen the third movie. This movie does a really good job of planting clues, but clues you can't possibly put together without having seen the third movie. So Palpatine builds up brilliantly, and he's kind of this political mastermind. He's got like the IQ of Mitch McConnell, but with the charisma of like a Donald Trump. So Palpatine's this brilliant political operative, and he really is able to sell himself as a master of virtue. And it turns out that even though he seems as honest and statesmanlike as someone like a Mitch McConnell, he's actually as deceptive and crooked as someone like Hillary Clinton. So it's a really brilliant character, and someone who you can both love and hate, and really kind of just have to admire as a bad guy, and really have to admire as a master manipulator. Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan also meet the Jedi Council at this point, and it turns out that the Jedi Council are not nearly as wise as they seem at first glance, or as we might have expected them to be. And I think that's one of the best parts of this movie, is that they really show the vulnerability of the Jedi Council, and they establish that so you know going into the second and third movies that you're dealing with a flawed institution. Now, Yoda is basically the same as we remembered him back in the original trilogy, except this time he's healthy. I mean, he's still very old, but he's still healthy. And we also meet some other Jedi as well. One of the other major leaders on the council is Mace Windu, played by Samuel L. Jackson. And he'll prove himself to be a badass, just as you would expect from Samuel L. Jackson in due time, but only after he sees that he was wrong in everything that he said in this movie. Now, here, he is the main leader against Qui-Gon Jinn. It's clear from the context that he is the reason why Qui-Gon Jinn is not on the council, because Mace Windu doesn't like him, And Mace Windu also questions Qui-Gon's judgment that Obi-Wan is ready to face his trials and become a full Jedi Knight. And he also rejects Qui-Gon's insistent demand that Anakin be trained as a Jedi and that Anakin is the chosen one. And it turns out that Mace Windu and Yoda and the rest were wrong on all three counts. And it's only after Mace Windu realizes that, he'll never admit it, but he does realize it, that he actually reaches his full potential and goes out and does good. You'll see that he becomes a badass in episodes 2 and 3. And in that sense, I guess you could compare Mace Windu with Ted Cruz in this most recent election. So Ted Cruz at first, because he didn't like Trump, stayed out of it. And if you think of Qui-Gon like Trump, eventually Ted Cruz did come out and campaign for him, even if he did so grudgingly. And that's basically the same relationship dynamic that Mace Windu and Qui-Gon Jinn have. While wrapping up the rest of the plot and everything that happens, I would like to stick with this general theme that Qui-Gon Jinn is effectively the Donald Trump of this movie. He is the savior and the guy who really ties everything together and put together a coalition of good guys to beat an overwhelming force of bad guys who are basically like the Democrats in this election. They were led by Hillary Clinton. They seemed unstoppable. But Qui-Gon, or Donald Trump, was able to really bring out the best in all of his allies and get everybody together on the same page. So first up on this honor roll is Natalie Portman's character, Queen Amidala, who was willing to fight in person and show some real balls, or whatever the female equivalent of balls would be. And she was a queen who led in person and was basically a warrior queen like Boudica or Xena or something like that. And she was just great in the closing scenes of this movie. She rallied her people to revolt, and they fought a whole battle in the palace, and it was really good. Jar Jar Binks, of course, lacked self-confidence and identity when he met Qui-Gon Jinn, but he learned how to be a leader from Qui-Gon Jinn, and he so impressed his own people that they elected him to be a, quote, bombad general. I'm not sure what that means, but I assume it's kind of like a 4-star general or something like that. And in the battle, we see that Jar Jar is by far the most effective of the Gungans. He personally destroys a few tanks, and his men seem to be inspired by him, and he seems to be the guy, having the strategy of setting up the shields and all that stuff. So he does a really good job, and ultimately the Gungans don't really win the whole thing, but Jar Jar puts up a very valiant effort, and in that sense it's kind of like how Ben Carson helped Trump to win a lot of black voters. Even if they didn't actually quite win the black vote, it was still an important part of Trump's ultimate victory. So I would say the same thing about Jar Jar Binks in this case. He did his best and he did really well, but ultimately he was only one part in this machine that was brought together by Qui-Gon Jinn. The malice at the palace actually broke into two separate battles, one with Padme and her guards, and the other one with Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan fighting a lightsaber duel against Darth Maul. Now, not only is this the best lightsaber duel in Star Wars history to this point, it will be surpassed in the other prequels, but to this point it had been by far the best duel. We see a 2-on-1 of Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan versus Maul, and Darth Maul really shows that he's actually a little better than we thought he was in that last scene, and he and Qui-Gon are going toe-to-toe, and Obi-Wan, as the junior man, is really struggling to keep up, and he almost falls to his death a few times. Later in the duel, Qui-Gon is actually struck down, and he dies when Darth Maul got an unlucky shot. And Obi-Wan continues the battle even though he's massively outmatched, because Qui-Gon has taught him well and he has to avenge his master and try to live up to that. Well, Obi-Wan actually does okay, but then, Darth Maul has him. And right as Darth Maul's about to finish him off, Obi-Wan pulls a Qui-Gon move. He does something risky, bold, and unexpected. He goes against the grain, and because Obi-Wan is normally a very staid person, very traditional, very establishment, but he follows the example of Qui-Gon and does the unexpected. And Darth Maul doesn't anticipate that move, and it allows Obi-Wan to slice him in half and win the battle. So that's another example of Qui-Gon acting like Donald Trump. He's this guy who breaks the mold and inspires others to do the same. And we'll see as time goes on that the Obi-Wan character actually got a lot better as the prequels progressed, because Obi-Wan decided to follow the example of Qui-Gon. And there's a scene where Obi-Wan greets his master as his master's dying, and Qui-Gon makes him promise to train Anakin, and Obi-Wan agrees, fatefully, since Obi-Wan was not quite ready to do something of that nature. And it's only fitting that the person most inspired by Qui-Gon Jinn, Anakin, is the guy who really won the battle. Now, Anakin got into a fighter for protection, a Naboo starfighter, and then he and R2-D2 flew up to join the space battle above Naboo against the Trade Federation. And during this battle, Anakin performs brilliantly. All that time as a pilot of pod racers really prepared him to be a fighter pilot, and that with his force abilities enabled him to land on this command ship, blast the engines, and then fly away unharmed as that ship exploded. And when that ship exploded, then all of the droid troops on the planet were deactivated, and the Gungans and others were able to officially seize victory. Now, this is brilliant on many levels, the way that this worked out. It shows that Anakin is the true heir to Qui-Gon Jinn, who was the primary organizer and mover and shaker in the movie. And it also shows that it was this organized response by what amounts to the People's Militia, meaning the Naboo, Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan acting on their own, Anakin acting on his own, and the Gungans that won when the government failed to show up. The Republic government didn't show up, and it took all these people standing together and acting as a militia to make things happen. So this movie actually is brilliant, and it really even further reinforces the point I was making that Qui-Gon Jinn is the Donald Trump of this movie. He really inspires people and makes things happen when their normal leaders, the establishment like the Jedi Council and the Republic, just simply can't get things done. I know that what I just said goes against the grain, and that the Donald Trump interpretation will probably not go over well with a lot of the liberals who like to troll my channel. However, there's one thing you need to keep in mind. What I just told you is objectively true. Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace, is objectively superior to the original trilogy in every single way. And we'll see that this excellence is continued throughout the prequels, even if they're not quite up to the same standard as Episode 1. Now, in conclusion, I'd like to say that I still believe, and I'm very serious about the idea, that Qui-Gon Jinn is the real linchpin to the prequels. Had Qui-Gon survived this movie and gone on to train Anakin himself, I think that Anakin would have turned out a lot differently. So the real tragedy of Star Wars Episode 1 is the death of Qui-Gon Jinn. Qui-Gon was much wiser than the Jedi Council. He would have called on the Palpatine a lot sooner. And he would have been the guy who would have really saved the Republic, even though he might have gone to prison for assassinating a senator, but he would have got the job done where the Jedi Council would not. And, you know what, guys, if you disagree with me, then you're just disagreeing with the truth, and as Jar Jar suggests, you can go fuck yourself. I'm Remarkable Republican, bringing you the truth with truth-flavored bias, signing out.